In the city of Pontiac, Michigan, a car company was born that would teach an entire American generation to love the sound of horsepower. It carried the name of an Ottawa war chief, and for 84 years it built machines that men still remember by heart. The wide track stance that sat low and planted on the pavement. The screaming chickens spread across the hood. The black coupe that outran a sheriff across the back roads of the South. More than 40 million cars rolled out under that arrowhead badge. And then, on the 31st of October 2010, the badge was retired, the showrooms went dark, and Pontiac was quietly struck from the books of General Motors. It did not die in a wreck. It died in a boardroom. This is the story of how a brand that sold pure excitement finally ran out of road. Here is the part that still stings for the people who grew up on these cars. Pontiac did not fail because it forgot how to build something thrilling. For one bright stretch of years in the 1960s, it built the most exciting cars in America, and the public could not get enough of them. What killed Pontiac came slowly, the way rust works, from the inside through 100 small decisions made by men counting costs in Detroit. There was no single fatal blow. There was a long bleeding, a death by 1,000 cuts, and at the center of it sat a parent company carrying too many brands, all fighting one another over a shrinking pool of buyers. To understand how it ended, you have to go back to a town, a chief, and a companion car that outlived its own parent. Pontiac began in 1926, and it began as a backup plan. General Motors already sold a car called the Oakland, built in Pontiac, Michigan, a respectable machine that was never quite cheap enough or quite exciting enough to win. So the company tried something clever. It created a companion make, a lower-priced running mate meant to bring in the buyers the Oakland could not reach. General Motors did the same trick with several of its divisions in those years, spinning off companion brands with names like Viking, Marquette, and LaSalle. Almost all of them died young. Only one companion ever outlived the parent. It was built to support, and that one was Pontiac. The new car carried a 6-cylinder engine but wore the price of a cheaper 4-cylinder, and it sold the moment it touched a showroom floor. They named it Pontiac, after the Ottawa war chief who had once laid siege to a British fort near Detroit, and after the city where it was built. The companion was supposed to prop up the parent. Instead, it buried it. By 1933, in the depths of the Great Depression, the Oakland was gone and Pontiac stood in its place. The understudy had walked onto the stage, and it would not leave for another 77 years. For the first half of the 20th century, Pontiac was the sensible choice with a little spark. It sold well through good times and bad. In some years it outran Oldsmobile and Buick, and it earned a steady reputation as the division where a working man could buy real power without paying Cadillac prices. It brought in honest engineering along the way. All steel roofs, hydraulic brakes, safety glass, smooth shifting transmissions, solid, useful things. But sensible does not build legends, and by the middle of the 1950s, the brand was respected and a little dull, the car your careful uncle bought. Along the way, the names piled up that older drivers still say with a little fondness. The Chieftain, the Star Chief, and in 1950 a new badge called the Catalina used first on the smooth pillarless hardtops that were the fashion of the moment. A name that would later grow into a full-size Pontiac and stay in the lineup for more than 30 years. These were good, solid, honest cars. They were also, measured against what was coming, fast asleep. In the new America of tail fins and drive-in movies, dull was beginning to look like a death sentence. The turn came in 1956, when a 42-year-old executive named Bunky Knudsen took over the division. Knudsen looked at Pontiac and saw exactly that problem, a brand that was admired in boring, and he decided to burn the boring out of it. He brought in two men who would shape everything that followed. Pete Estes, a gifted engineer pulled over from Oldsmobile, and a sharp, restless young engineer named John DeLorean hired away from Packard. Their assignment was simple and a little dangerous. Make Pontiac fast and make people want it. Knudsen started by tearing off the past. He stripped away the old Indian head ornament and the silver streaks of chrome that had run down the center of the hood for years, the proud marks of the cautious, comfortable Pontiac your uncle drove. Out went the symbols of safe. Then he went looking for speed, on the street and on the racetrack, pushing the division hard into stock car racing on the simple theory that a win on Sunday sold cars on Monday. It was more than a slogan. Pontiacs began winning on the big ovals, and every checkered flag was photographed, advertised, and turned into showroom traffic the following week. In the public mind, the cautious old Pontiac was being painted over by a car that won. In 1957, the new direction took shape as a car called the Bonneville, named for the salt flats in Utah where men had long gone to chase land speed records. It was a limited-run convertible, and it carried Pontiac's first fuel-injected engine, a flag planted in the ground that said this division now belonged to performance. Only about 630 of them were built that first year, and each one carried a price near $5,800, which in that era was Cadillac money. Pontiac called the Bonneville America's #1 road car, and for once the boast had teeth behind it. Then came the look that made the brand. In 1959, Pontiac pushed the wheels on its cars almost 5 inches farther apart than the other General Motors models built on the very same underbody. They called it wide track. It was part real engineering and part pure theater. The wider stance did help the car grip the road, but more than that, it gave the machine a low-planted swagger that made everything parked next to it look narrow and tall and old-fashioned, like a tipsy motorhome on skinny tires. The public loved it. Motor Trend magazine named the entire Pontiac line its Car of the Year, and the dreamy advertisements painted by two artists, Art Fitzpatrick and Van Kaufman, all long horizons and warm golden light, sold something far deeper than sheet metal. They sold youth and style and the feeling that the best part of your life was just about to begin. Pontiac's decade had arrived. The man who turned that momentum into a movement was John DeLorean, who took over the division in 1965. He was unlike any executive General Motors had produced before, a tall, restless engineer with a movie star jaw and a hunger for the spotlight. The same DeLorean who would one day walk away from the company, put his own name on a stainless steel sports car with doors that opened toward the sky, and end up at the center of one of the strangest scandals the car world ever saw. All of that came later. In the 1960s, he was simply the most dangerous kind of carman, the kind who understood something the accountants in Detroit never could. Young men did not want sensible. They wanted to be a little frightened and a lot thrilled, both at the same time, and they would empty their savings for the privilege. So he broke a rule. General Motors had an edict on the books that kept its mid-size cars from carrying engines above a certain size, a sensible limit meant to keep the brands in their lanes. DeLorean got around it with a lawyer's trick. He did not build a new model. He offered a big engine as an option package on the existing Tempest, a car light enough to be set on fire by it. He borrowed 3 letters from a famous Ferrari and called the package the GTO. And in 1964, he turned it loose before anyone upstairs could think to say no. It worked beyond anyone's prediction. Pontiac had quietly guessed it might sell 5,000 of them. It sold more than 30,000 in that first year alone, and the planners in Detroit watched the orders pour in with something close to disbelief. The car wrapped a 389 cubic inch engine in a body that had no business holding it, and it was loud and fast and crucially cheap enough that a young man with a steady factory job could actually afford one. Within 2 years, nearly every rival had scrambled to build a muscle car of its own, chasing the fire that DeLorean had lit by quietly breaking a corporate rule. It is widely called the first true American muscle car, the machine that lit the fuse on the entire era, and by 1966 it was no longer an option buried in a brochure. It had become its own model, its own legend, often wearing 3 two-barrel carburetors that Pontiac advertised as Tri-Power. Then, in 1967, Pontiac answered Ford's runaway Mustang with a sleek coupe called the Firebird, a car that shared its underlying bones with the brand-new Chevrolet Camaro, but carried an attitude all its own. 2 years later, the division went further than anyone thought a buttoned-up corporation would allow. The GTO gained a stripped-down, brightly painted, loudly named version called the Judge. The Firebird gained a high-winged, big-engine version called the Trans Am. More power, sharper handling, hoods that scooped in air, and spoilers that cut it. By the early 70s, the Trans Am could be ordered with a Super Duty 455 engine, one of the last truly ferocious muscle motors built before the rules closed in. And, in 1973, the Trans Am received the decal that would outlive the company that made it, an enormous golden bird spread wing to wing across the hood. Officially, Pontiac called it the Firebird. Every man who ever owned one called it the Screaming Chicken. By then, the car had escaped the showroom entirely and driven straight into American culture. In 1977, a black and gold Trans Am tore across the South in a movie called Smokey and the Bandit, with Burt Reynolds grinning behind the wheel and a red-faced sheriff named Buford Justice always one curve behind. The film was a runaway hit, and the car became a genuine star, as recognizable as any actor in it. For a generation of boys watching from the back seat of their father's plain sedan, the lesson burned in deep and stayed there. Speed was freedom. Horsepower was joy. And the badge on the front of all that joy was a simple red arrowhead that said Pontiac. There was a deliberate craft to that conditioning, and Pontiac knew exactly what it was doing. It seeded its cars into the places young men gathered. It built a dealer network that welcomed the kid with grease under his nails as warmly as it welcomed the banker. It put its name on the drag strip and the stock car oval, where a Saturday win became Monday's foot traffic. A whole generation of baby boomers was taught, car by car and advertisement by advertisement, to measure a man partly by what sat under his hood. That lesson would pay Pontiac back handsomely for a decade. It would also leave the brand stranded when the world changed, because a company that has trained its customers to want only horsepower has nothing to offer them on the day horsepower itself goes out of style. This was the summit. And like every summit, it could not be held. The forces that would grind a muscle car down were already gathering at the edge of the decade. The trouble did not announce itself with a crash. It came as a slow tightening, year after year. Late in the 1960s, the first gas crisis arrived, and fuel that had been cheap enough to waste suddenly cost real money at the pump. Insurance companies studied the wreck and death rates in these fast cars and raised their premiums until a young man could barely afford to insure the very thing he had worked overtime to buy. New rules on emissions and crash safety landed every year, each one squeezing a little more power out of the engines and adding a little more weight to the cars. Over a few short seasons, the muscles simply drained away. The horsepower numbers fell. The machines that had been lean and ferocious grew heavy and soft, personal luxury cars wearing the old proud names with none of the old fire underneath. Only the Firebird truly held on, and it held on in large part because of one movie and one screaming chicken. In 1981, Pontiac tried to bottle the thing it had lost. It launched a marketing campaign built on two simple words: "We build excitement," and stamped that promise across a lineup that mostly could not deliver it. The 6000, the Grand Am, the Grand Prix, the Firebird, and a strange little two-seater called the Fiero. The Fiero arrived in 1984 and surprised everyone by selling well. It was a mid-engine sports car offered for the price of an ordinary commuter, and for a moment it looked like Pontiac had found its old spark again. Then the early cars began to catch fire. A flaw in the engine could let oil reach hot metal, and a number of Fieros burst into flame at the side of the road, ending in a recall that stained the car's name for good. It was a small disaster, but it told a much larger story. Pontiac was now being built down to a price, and the corners that were being quietly cut had started showing up as smoke on the shoulder of the highway. Through the 1980s, the 90s, and into the 2000s, most of what Pontiac sold were tired, forgettable versions of cars that other General Motors divisions sold at the same time. The same platforms, the same engines, a different badge and a slightly different grille. Some were not even General Motors cars underneath at all. For a stretch in the late 1980s, the model Pontiac sold as the Le Mans, Once the proud name that had launched the GTO was in truth a small economy car designed in Germany and built in South Korea. Shipped across the ocean and badged as a Pontiac, the name that had once meant American muscle now meant a borrowed import with an arrowhead glued to the nose. To hide the sameness on the rest of the lineup, Pontiac reached for plastic. Body cladding, thick gray panels glued along the flanks of nearly every model, piled on so heavily that the brand became a national punchline for the stuff. There was the minivan, the Transport, launched in 1990, with a long sloping plastic nose that earned it a cruel and lasting nickname. People called it the Dustbuster, after the little handheld vacuum cleaner it so unfortunately resembled. The division that had once built America's #1 road car was now bolting gray plastic onto a rebadged van. And then there was the Aztec. Launched at the turn of the new century, it was meant to be a bold, rugged crossover for young and active buyers. Instead, it became one of the most ridiculed vehicles ever sold in America, a shape so strange and so badly resolved that it still lands on lists of the ugliest cars ever built, more than 20 years later. In a final strange twist, the Aztec found a kind of fame again long after Pontiac was gone, when a desperate chemistry teacher turned drug maker drove a battered gold one through a celebrated television series. Somehow, the perfect car for a man whose ordinary life was quietly falling apart. The Aztec did not kill Pontiac on its own, but it became the public face of everything that had gone wrong. A brand that had once defined cool was now defining the exact opposite, and doing it, of course, in plastic. But step back from any single bad car, and the deeper problem comes into view, and it was never really about styling at all. It was arithmetic. General Motors carried far too many brands by the 2000s, and those brands had begun to feed on one another, each one scrapping with the others for a slice of a shrinking pool of American buyers. Pontiac, the affordable sporty division, was now chasing the same young families that Chevrolet wanted. Every Pontiac sold was too often a Chevrolet that went unsold. Inside a strong and growing company, that kind of overlap might have been trimmed and managed. Inside a company sliding toward collapse, it was simply fatal. There was a name for what had happened to the cars themselves. The industry called it badge engineering, the practice of building one basic vehicle and selling it through several divisions with little more than the emblems and the grille changed. It saved enormous sums in the short run. In the long run, it taught buyers a quiet and deadly lesson that the badge on the hood no longer pointed to anything real, that a Pontiac and a Chevrolet and an Oldsmobile were 3 doors into the same plain room. Once a customer learns there is no true difference, loyalty dies. And loyalty, in the end, was the only thing a brand like Pontiac had ever really been selling. This is the cost that almost never shows up in the story when it is told quickly. It belonged to the people of Pontiac, Michigan, the town that gave the brand its name and built its cars for decades. The assembly work there had carried families for 2 and 3 generations, fathers training sons on the line, the way other trades pass down a craft. A man could leave high school, walk into the plant, and build a solid middle-class life with his hands, a house, a pension, a boat in the driveway maybe, all of it resting on the steady rhythm of the line. As the brand faded and the corporation shrank, that work drained out of the town, plant by plant and shift by shift, the same way it drained out of a dozen other Midwestern factory towns in those same hard years. The badge dying in a boardroom was only the headline. The quieter loss, the one that never reached the business pages, was a whole community that had built its identity and its paychecks and its sense of who it was around a red arrowhead. Late in the decade, the long collapse finally arrived. The financial crisis of 2008 pushed General Motors to the very edge, and in 2009 the company fell into a government-managed bankruptcy, kept alive only by a federal rescue. When the men in charge sat down to decide which brands would live and which would be put down, they kept 4: Chevrolet, Buick, Cadillac, GMC. Pontiac was not among them. It was marked for the chopping block in part because of its fading sales, and in part for a crueler reason. It stole too many customers from Chevrolet, the one brand the company could not afford to lose. The division that had once outsold its rivals was killed, in the end, partly for being too good at taking sales from the family. There was one last cruelty in the timing. Just before the end, Pontiac had finally built something genuinely good again, a powerful, well-balanced sedan called the G8 that the magazines actually loved. There was a quiet irony folded into it. The car that critics called the best Pontiac in years was not really an American car at all. It was built in Australia, a rear-drive sedan from General Motors' Holden division, shipped halfway around the world to wear a Pontiac badge. The brand that had begun as an all-American answer to imported cars closed its story by selling an import of its own. And it arrived too late, at the worst possible moment, dropped into a market that had already stopped paying attention. The public had drifted away years before, and they showed it in the only language that ever truly counts in this business. They stopped walking into the showrooms. For the dealers, many of whom had sold nothing but Pontiacs for 30 years and knew their best customers by name, the announcement was a slow death sentence with a date stamped on it. They marked down the last cars, answered the worried questions about parts and warranties as honestly as they could, and watched the arrowhead come down off the sign out front. The last Pontiac, a plain silver sedan, came off the line early in 2010. On the 31st of October that year, the final dealer agreements quietly expired, and the brand that had taught America to crave horsepower was gone, 84 years after a humble companion car had buried its own parent. It was an undignified ending for something that had once been mighty. But the cars themselves refused to disappear. Out in garages all across the country, the machines that Pontiac built in its glory years are still alive. Restored and polished and fired up on warm summer evenings by men who remember exactly what they cost when they were new. A real 1969 GTO Judge, or an early Trans Am with the screaming chicken still intact across the hood, is now worth more than the modest houses some of them were once parked in front of. There is even a small company down in Florida that will build you a brand new Trans Am. A modern Chevrolet Camaro reshaped and rebadged and breathed on until it makes 1,000 horsepower. A car the old factory never could have dreamed of. The badge is dead. The want it created never was. That may be the truest thing anyone can say about Pontiac. For one bright run of years it understood a thing its own accountants never did, that a car can be far more than a way to get to work. That it can be a feeling a young man will chase for the rest of his life. The company that owned that magic spent its final decades slowly forgetting it, one cut and one gray plastic panel at a time, until there was nothing left to sell but the name on the badge. The men who ran the numbers could never find the excitement on a balance sheet. So in the end, they simply crossed it out. And a brand that had managed to outlive its own parent could not, in the end, outlive its own parent's calculator. Maybe you remember Pontiac. Maybe your first real car was a second-hand Firebird you saved for all summer, or maybe your father came home smelling of the plant in Pontiac, Michigan, with another long shift behind him. Maybe there is still a GTO under a cover in your garage, started up only on the best days of the year. If a Pontiac ever meant something to you, tell us about it in the comments. The model, the year, and what it felt like the first time you put your foot down and the back of the car squatted toward the pavement. Stories like these stay alive only when the people who lived them write them down. Subscribe and help us keep the record straight.